and the fetters they used to wear. Number 3, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is the exemplar or the model for every God-conscious human being. And again, the famous verse of the Quran, a good example, uswatan hasanatan, you have in Allah's Messenger for all whose hope is in Allah and the final day and who remember Allah frequently. And number 4, the Prophet Muhammad is the executor of Allah's laws. As Allah said, obey Allah and the Messenger so that you may find mercy in Him. Because the Prophet Muhammad is the executor of divine authority, his commands must be obeyed by Muslims as if they came from Allah Himself. This authority is not a matter of debate as it was for the munafiqun or hypocrites, for it is confirmed by Allah in His revelation and thus does not require the prior approval of anyone. The lack of acceptance of the munafiqun of this point was indeed their main problem. However, there is still a valid question to be brought up today. And again, I'm speaking as much to the youth in the audience as to the elders because so much of this conference is focused on the youth. There is a valid question to bring up today on the limits of what you might call prophetic authority or the limits of the sunnah in the context of a society like this. Indeed, it's an important issue even for early jurists. Although it is very clear in the Quran that the Prophet is to be obeyed, and no sincere Muslim ever doubted the Prophet or doubted that one must obey the Prophet during his lifetime, the authority of the prophetic sunnah as a source of Islamic law, in other words, the sunnah as a source of the eventual tradition of Sharia and fiqh, is not specifically confirmed or mentioned in the Quran itself. The Quran really doesn't talk about specifically what people are supposed to do with the sunnah after the Prophet's death. Obviously it's to be respected, obviously it's a guide for us, but how literally is it supposed to be taken? Eventually, the ulama of Islam had to make use of analogy or qiyas to institutionalize the Prophet's example so that it would be continued to be taken as obligatory for later generations of believers. To give you one example of how this lack of a specific discussion of the Sunnah in Quran can lead to widely different interpretations of Islam, let me for just a moment take the example of the Ismailis. In the Ismaili community, the Sunnah that is followed by this particular sect is the Sunnah of their Imams, specifically the Sunnah of the Imam who lives among them. As Sunni Muslims, most of us anyway, we don't follow this interpretation, but the Ismailis can get away with this interpretation and make an argument of it because of this lacuna, because of this gap in the Quranic text where it is not specifically said what to do with the Sunnah of the Prophet himself. So they simply say, what our Imam today tells us is in accordance with what the Prophet taught, so when we follow the Imam, it's as if we're following the Prophet. This is how this particular issue can be resolved, or not resolved, but can sort of branch out or flower out in political ways. However, the acceptance of the Prophet Muhammad's continued authority in time, from the time of his own life until today, has become so widespread and so accepted among Muslims that most believers who are sincere try to follow the Prophet's Sunnah as literally as they can, even including some behaviors that say that I myself, as a scholar of religion, might not describe as religious, perhaps in nature. To find a comfortable mean, to find a way to determine what aspects of the Prophet's Sunnah are obligatory for everyone and what aspects are matters of choice, the fuqaha, the jurists of Islam, the imams of the juridical traditions, eventually divided the Sunnah into examples that are shari, those that serve as sources of law, and those that are ghair shari, and those that were not meant to be legally binding. So when you look in the four schools of Sunni jurisprudence, whether it's Maliki, Hanafi, Hanbali, or Shafi'i, one finds that the Sunnah, the example of the Prophet, is broken up into two sides. There's the Sunnah Shari'ah, those aspects of the Prophet's example that all of us as Muslims are required to follow, and the Sunnah Ghair Sharia, that which is more a matter of choice. I, in a way, prefer the way the Hanafis talk about it. They talk about things as Sharia. This is the Sunnah Sharia, the things we must follow, and on the other side, taqwa, those things that people do out of a fear or a love or a respect or a consciousness of Allah. So again, by no means am I implying here, or did the jurists imply, that people should not, out of taqwa, out of love for Allah and fear of Allah, follow as much of His example as possible. The difference is, part of it is obligatory, part of it's a matter of choice. So this non-shari aspect of the Prophet's sunnah, the personal and cultural details of the Prophet's example, for example, such as certain rules of etiquette, the use of a miswak or acacia stick to brush one's teeth, issues like that become particularly important to young people and those of us Muslims who live in the context of a country like the United States, which is not Muslim, shares some Muslim values, and then does not have others. Also, if the vast majority of Muslims, as they are today, are culturally not Arab, is it necessary to follow each and every example of the Prophet's etiquette, including those Arab practices that were practiced before Islam? Did the Prophet really intend that every Muslim use miswak to brush his teeth, or simply that one should practice good dental hygiene? In fact, I've heard the question asked, would the Prophet use toothpaste if he were alive today? What would it be, Mentadent, Colgate, whatever? Does the Prophet's approval of personal habits, such as putting henna on one's beard, eating arak fruit, avoiding garlic when talking to eminent persons, mean that all Muslims must do the same? Common sense usually tells us that we can differentiate between actions that are cultural from those that are not. But if we start making a differentiation between cultural aspects of the Sunnah and religious aspects of the Sunnah, where do we draw the line? That's the difficult question. Which non-ritual aspects of the Sunnah, apart from dhikr, apart from salat and things like that, which non-ritual aspects of the Sunnah are fard and which are merely hasan? These questions, again, are very important questions, practical questions for Muslims today. Even if we agree on what categories of the Prophet's Sunnah should be taken as obligatory, there's the additional problem of verification. Although the ulama have long agreed that Muslims must obey the Prophet's verified and specific commands, the oral nature of the transmission of hadith